Hi, I'm Rodney Evans. I'm the steward of the Ready, and I'm here today to talk to you about navigating a new organizational age. Do you ever feel like work is getting harder all the time and like making change is super hard? Just also like doing life from parenting to getting an answer from customer service is harder than ever? Why do you think that is? It isn't that we aren't trying. In fact, we're trying harder than ever. And it actually seems like the harder we try, the harder it gets. This is especially true in organizations that are trying to solve complex problems, and almost all of them are. Whether it's a new op model, an inability to prioritize effectively, strained relations between the board and the exec team, it just doesn't seem like our best efforts are enough anymore. And the data bears this out. Work as we know it is failing to meet the moment. 90% of senior executives say they failed to reach strategic goals because of poor implementation. 77% of professionals have experienced burnout in their jobs. It isn't that we aren't trying, it's that we're trying so hard at doing the wrong things. Today, we start to chart a new course. With some help from my teammates, Jason and Ali, we'll be exploring how we got to this point, why we've gotten stuck here, and what you can start doing to swim out of it. Specifically, we'll talk about the new organizational age that we're living in and how it feels like a lot of us have hangovers from the last two. We'll cover why the way that many of us were taught and coached to lead isn't serving us or our teams any longer, and what's really required to steward a thriving organization today. And finally, we'll talk about how new systems of work treat organizations like the complex environments that they are. First, over to Jason for a little history.
Let's start where this current conundrum began, because the challenges we're facing now go back to the early 1900s. The industrial age was marked by the assembly line. Consistency and efficiency were the words of the day, so organizations can make the same size shoes and same tasting cornflakes again and again. The information age was marked by the computer, and its moves were about strategy and execution, about planning and operationalizing those plans to use a new sea of information. Here's the rub. We've hung on to ways of operating from these two now historic eras despite all that's changed, which is basically everything. We call the present age the intelligence age, and it's been unfolding for a couple of decades. The intelligence age is marked by the internet. Today, strategy and execution are no longer sufficient. Instead, the intelligence age asks us to create clarity and ease from the overwhelm of limitless choice. We can think about organizations and how they worked in each age like this. Organizations in the industrial age were like a boat to be built. The focus was on reducing work down to its smallest components. In the information age, they were like aquariums to be tended. The focus was on detailed strategic planning, increased execution, and getting the fish to do the most they could inside their tank. But in the intelligence age, our organizations have evolved into diverse ecosystems teeming with life. They're complex, meaning they're more like an ocean, which can neither be commanded nor controlled. We need less planning and process, and more design and experimentation, because we're no longer dealing with boats or fish tanks. In today's world, your strategy deck won't hold back the tide. This shift means the harder we push on the old ways, on the moves fit for the industrial and information ages, the slower, worse, and more costly work becomes. The frustrating mismatch between relying on industrial and information age moves with what this new age actually demands from us means everything is harder than ever. This graphic is a prime example of trying harder at the wrong thing. Adding administration on top of the real work to be done is expensive, and very few patients or physicians are feeling the benefit. This isn't unique to healthcare. We see this unchecked bureaucratic layering with functions like PMOs and change management, and the ROI just isn't there. You can't blame the people doing those jobs. It's that adding processes and monitoring and roles on top of real work doesn't translate to efficiency or customer value. Every organization has a version of this kind of growth. It's the headcount reduction that ultimately added cost, or the project management workflow that means people spend more time reporting on work than doing it. All of this high effort, low impact trying is hurting work, and it only gets worse when you're working cross functionally or trying to get after something for the first time. What does the intelligence age mean for leaders? It means letting go of not only the factory floor mindset, but also the top down empowerment mindset. It means admitting that making plans for others to execute has largely failed. It means confronting the fact that servant leadership hasn't led to more autonomy, but instead more dependence and burnout. It means accepting that analysis and planning alone won't change anything in a complex environment. And it also means unlearning the outdated moves leaders still cling to, even when those moves have proven ineffective. Sensing is different from analysis. It's a skill that asks leaders to look forward and backward, notice trends and patterns, and understand that there won't be one data-informed answer, because complex problems don't have one simple answer. The Deming adage that every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets is the most important mantra every leader must internalize. The intelligence age asks us to shift from leadership to stewardship. Management science from the industrial age said thinking was only for leaders and to leave the doing to workers. Later, in the information age, new theories encouraged leaders to push the thinking down to the workforce so they could develop judgment and agency. Stewardship asks all of us to both think and do at every level. It's the VP taking customer complaint calls herself, or the CMO participating in user tests. The thinking-doing integration is how we actually enact probing, sensing, responding, connecting those making the plans with what customers are experiencing. Stewardship is not about ownership. It's about creating a resilient environment where folks at every level feel responsible for doing the work and thinking about how the work gets done. It requires multiplayer participation, not one leader's heroics. The best stewards know that aquarium moves will fail in the ocean. They know that when you're coordinating large groups of humans, you're likely to be surprised, and you can't do it alone. We've been treating organizations like fish tanks, synthetic, tidy, closed systems where we control the temperature, light, water, and food. If a fish goes belly up, buy a new one. If some fish are fighting, replace them. If they're bored, buy them a treasure chest, or in office speak, a shiny new VR headset. We need to see our organizations as oceans. They're complex, not controllable, and their depths are largely unexplored. We can't manage them, but we can learn to navigate. If you're thinking that's all too academic, we'll say this. Most of our work with clients over the last 10 years is a return to common sense, good habits, and simplification.
So let's dive in. Some of you might already be familiar with other models that use the concept of layers and visibility to explore an organization's culture. Instead, today we'll be exploring an organization's approach to work and teaming. The terms we'll use are real oceanographic terms. They not only describe the depths of the ocean, but also how much light penetrates each depth. We see these zones as a meaningful parable for how to think about organizations. Let's start with the sky. The sky floats above the ocean. It's the external environment, where threats and opportunities can be sensed, and it's full of signals an organization can and should respond to. The sunshine zone is the top layer the light shines through. Things in the sunshine zone are highly visible from the surface. These are like the explicit and obvious outcomes of work. The twilight zone is where some light gets through, but plenty is invisible too. It's murky. In this zone, teams and teams of teams are determining how they'll work, testing and experimenting with ways of working like how they decide, how they meet, and how they define strategy. Finally, there's the midnight zone. Like in other models, this is the individual and emotional experience of people operating in an organization as they respond to everything going on around them. Modern-day stewardship means keeping these depths working together, doing just enough at each level to create a thriving ecosystem. Keep this mental model in mind. The doing Jason talked about earlier takes place in the twilight zone. The best leaders and teams know this and move beyond what is obvious at the surface. They don't subscribe to the idea that what's most visible is the real work and everything else is just extracurricular. However, in most organizations, leaders forget to consider how these steps work together. This usually leads to a lack of coordination, with little going on in the sky. And in the sunshine zone, there's usually a strategy deck either built or bought. In the twilight zone, there is some attention on something like a clarified training program. And in the midnight zone, there is maybe some nice perk for employees, like a yoga class. But there's no connection or coherence between the zones, so we blame the work product in each for not delivering. Instead of seeing the incoherence as the problem, we blame the deck, the training program, or the wellness initiative. This isn't how we design an organization to get the results we want. So, how do we get to that level of disconnect? It often looks like this. We spend some time looking at the sky, but often in reaction to an unexpected event or emergency. We don't consider our external environment on a set rhythm. And usually this only happens at senior levels, like boards and execs. And we spend too much time in the sunshine zone, fiddling over plans, communications, and assets. If we don't get the outcomes we're after, we jump right over the twilight zone and dive into the midnight zone. When folks' behavior impacts execution, we invest in things like coaching, managing, and training. But skipping over the twilight zone is a big problem because the strategy execution gap happens in the twilight zone. Ignoring the twilight zone creates a dynamic of setting goals and then telling people to just make sure they happen, without paying attention to whether people have the tools, processes, resources, or conditions to enable them. When this unsustainable dynamic happens to go well, which is far from every time, it relies on individual heroics and overwork rather than on simple, effective routines. Instead, an organization that has evolved for the intelligence age looks like this. Their boards and execs are actively sensing what's coming in the sky, rather than reacting after it happens. Leaders and managers in the sunshine zone are spending more time implementing and refining their strategy than they are planning it. And the twilight zone sees teams experimenting with new ways of working to close the strategy execution gap in tight feedback loops with their leaders. And down in the midnight zone, individuals are processing their experience with support from their organizations. So let's walk through an example of how this looks in action. For many, AI is top of mind. We sense its opportunities and its threats in the sky, so it prompts a lot of hand-wringing in traditional organizations. The obvious move for most organizations falls into the sunshine zone. They'll add something about AI implementation to a strategic plan. But that's also where most organizations stop. From there, we cross our fingers and hope leaders figure out the execution piece. Instead, intelligence age leaders step back and consider their entire ocean. This leads to seeing more tangible opportunities in the twilight zone, like using AI to automate meeting notes or enhance productivity. It also leads to recognizing the importance of the midnight zone in achieving the outcomes we want. Intelligence age leaders don't just tell people to get over resistance and cynicism, they invest in understanding, and they put support and feedback loops in place. This shift can be a massive advantage because organizations always feel the impact of what's happening in the midnight zone and the other zones, but they often don't take the time to understand why those reactions are happening. When we do, we can unlock far better outcomes. If you're seeing some version of this gap playing out right now within your own organization, trust us, you're not alone.
You might be feeling a little overwhelmed by that deep dive into the zones, but there is a practice to help you navigate them. We call it depth finding, and you're probably already doing it more than you think. Depth finding isn't a practice for one individual leader or hero to do alone. It's for small groups of stewards to do together across their teams, in cross-functional projects, or the entire organization. Depth finding is how we redefine work for the intelligence age. It's how we go from seeing the visible and obvious aspect of our organization as the real work, thinking of the sunshine zone as what's important, and instead to navigating through all four zones with real mastery. The practice of depth finding teaches us to notice where we're operating and what our ecosystem needs. Organizations spend far more money, energy, and time on their explicit aims and their measurement than on how they're going to get there. Think of the yellow diamond here as representing sunlight. How deep organizational focus usually goes is kind of like how much sun penetrates. The sunshine zone is so shallow in the ocean, and yet it's where most of the organization's resources end up being deployed. Depth finding helps us dive deeper and create sustainable, scalable routines in the twilight zone. It's bringing that light and that focus down a depth. That's how we bring those explicit aims to life. Humans are buoyant. We're drawn to the surface of the ocean, just like the surface of our organization. It's just more comfortable to float than to hold our breath and dive in. But it's the twilight zone, not the sunshine zone, that's the highest leverage point in designing your organization to get different results. The purpose of depth finding is to bring more light into the twilight zone. This probably won't feel natural at first, given how leadership has been defined in the industrial and information ages, but it is necessary. The routines that are effective in the twilight zone can be shared and scaled across an organization. This is how we get efficiency and organizational resilience. This is how we have ease and get out of the cycle of the harder we try, the harder it gets. What happens in the twilight zone is also how we can start to understand what's going on in the invisibility of the midnight zone, the human reactions that emerge when we try new things. Rather than trying to coach folks out of their feelings in the midnight zone, instead we can create support structures so they can participate well in the twilight zone. This is how we start to steward our ocean. The greatest advantage any organization has is its ability to understand itself. Yet, most aren't using this superpower to operate in complexity, and from there to become expert in what depth needs attention. Bringing clarity and light down from the surface of work, balancing the needs of those depths is the future of work. Once you understand how work can live at every depth, you can close the gaps between strategy and execution, between culture and the individual experience, between thinking and doing. You already know how to do depth finding, even if it's a new word. Honing this practice and making it explicit is all you need to be able to steward in an intelligence age organization. Every organization has its version of the ocean. As you start to practice depth finding in your team, you'll begin to see that every zone has levers that can be over or underused to solve problems. And importantly, you can't solve a problem at the same depth in which it was created. If your sunshine zone strategy was an epic failure, a sunshine zone restructuring is not going to fix your problem. Here's a cheat sheet to get you started. Think of the sky as your external why, where you ask questions like, are we doing scenario planning, future casting, landscape analysis? Are we doing it enough? Are we underinvested there? The sunshine zone is your what. Have you made explicit and shared what your aim is, what the signals of progress are, like outcomes or metrics, how the organization is structured? This should be the transparent, visible, obvious what of the organization. The twilight zone is the how. Are your meetings, your agreement making, your tooling, your decision making bringing you closer to that what or farther away from it? And finally, the midnight zone is each person's individual why. You can start to understand this by seeing whether people can engage in the twilight zone, whether they can show up flexibly, whether they're resisting or retreating. The answers to those questions lie in the midnight zone. I think you're ready to start your depth finding practice. All you have to do is start seeing and seeking the murky, unclear ways of working that are in need of some sunlight. Because when you start to think of your organization as an ocean, you can start to imagine yourself as its explorer. We can't wait to hear what you discover. Please keep in touch.